When Israel struck and killed one of Iran's most powerful insiders, it looked like a major breakthrough. Another key figure removed, another step forward in weakening Iran's system. But there's a deeper question here. What if this doesn't weaken the system, but makes the war harder to end? To understand that, you have to understand who Ali Larijani really was. Not just a senior leader, not just part of the establishment, he was something more subtle, a bridge. Someone who could move between different centers of power inside Iran, especially the clerical leadership, the military establishment, and the diplomatic world. He wasn't always the loudest voice, but he was one of those few who could translate power into negotiation, and in a system like Iran's, that role matters more than it appears. See, Iran's system isn't simple. It's layered, it's decentralized, and in many ways, deliberately complex. Different power centers exist at the same time. The supreme leader defines authority, the military, especially the Revolutionary Guard, executes it, and then there are figures like Larijani who help coordinate, interpret, and sometimes balance these forces. Remove one layer and the system doesn't necessarily collapse. It changes shape. We've seen something similar like this before. When the US killed Qasem Soleimani in 2020, there were fears of escalation, but the system still had structure. There were still people who could manage the response, absorb the shock, and keep things within a certain boundary. This time, however, the situation is very different because this isn't happening in isolation. In the early wave of strikes, dozens, exactly 49 high-level Iranian commanders were reportedly killed. The command structure has already taken a hit, and Iran's military doctrine was already partially decentralized, with different units and regions operating with a degree of autonomy. So what you are essentially left with is not a system that shuts down, but one that keeps running without tight coordination. And that's honestly where the real problem begins, because wars don't just need firepower, they need control. They need someone who can decide when to escalate and when to stop. And more importantly, someone who can talk and negotiate. Let's say the United States or Israel decides at some point that they have achieved their objectives, that they want to pause or let's say de-escalate. Who do they exactly speak to? Who represents the system? Who can make a decision that others will follow? Because Larijani was one of the last figures who could do that. He wasn't just part of the system. He helped make the system negotiable, and now that layer may be gone forever. At the same time, internal dynamics are shifting. Larijani was known to have reservations about certain leadership transitions, including the possible elevation of Mojtaba Khamenei. With him gone, one more layer of internal dissent or balance disappears, and what remains is a system that could become more consolidated, more like a military dictatorship with a clerical facade, more controlled by hardline structures, less flexible, less open to negotiation, and that's when war becomes dangerous in a very peculiar way. Not because they escalate suddenly, but because they lose the ability to stop. At that point, the war doesn't need constant decisions. It begins to run on momentum, on autopilot. Retaliation follows retaliations, signals get misread, escalation becomes automatic, and it starts to feel less like strategy and more like an endless loop, a system responding to itself. And this is where the global stakes return, because none of this exists in isolation. The Strait of Hormuz is still vulnerable, oil markets are still unstable, the risk of a wider economic shock hasn't gone away. So what looked like a tactical success may have introduced a strategic complication. Because it's always easier to start a war. You act, you strike, you escalate, but ending a war requires something very different. It requires structure, communication, and people who can navigate both power and restraint. And sometimes, removing those people doesn't end the war. It just makes it harder to stop. I am Abhijit, and you are watching DNA Explained.